Imagine taking a quiet walk in the Montana woods, and your dog suddenly leads you to something buried beneath the earth. A worn backpack, a hidden journal, a desperate message from a woman who vanished without a trace. That's exactly what happened to Jake, a former Marine trying to rebuild his life in peace. But when he opened that journal, he uncovered a secret the entire town was trying to bury. In the darkness of the forest, with only his loyal German shepherd by his side, Jake stepped into a mystery far bigger than he ever imagined. One involving corruption, betrayal, and a miracle that only God himself could have orchestrated. Stay with us as we follow Jake and Ranger through the shadows of Pine Ridge, where every clue leads deeper, and every step could be their last. If this story touches your heart, please consider subscribing. It truly helps this channel grow. Thank you so much for watching, and may God bless every one of you. The early autumn in rural Montana had a way of feeling both peaceful and unforgiving at the same time, especially near the small town of Pine Ridge. A quiet community surrounded by endless forests and steep ridgelines that caught the wind like the ribs of some ancient creature. The air that afternoon was crisp and dry, carrying the scent of pine needles and the faint smoke of distant chimneys as the season slowly shifted toward winter. The sky was a soft silver, heavy with clouds that moved slowly across the valley, as if contemplating whether to release rain or simply hover above the land. Jake Miller, a 38-year-old former Marine with a broad, angular build shaped by years of physical discipline, walked along the familiar trail behind his modest cabin. He carried himself with the natural caution of someone who had seen too much during deployment, his rugged jawline shadowed by a few days of unshaven stubble, and his dark blonde hair kept short for convenience rather than style. Jake's face carried the quiet weight of a man who had long learned to live with memories he rarely spoke about. Memories of choices made in the chaos of war that shaped his calm, observant, and sometimes overly guarded nature. Despite his tough exterior, Jake was gentle with those he trusted and thoughtful in the way he read people and situations, a skill sharpened by both military service and years of solitude. Walking a few steps ahead of him was Ranger, his 3-year-old German shepherd with a muscular frame, thick sable-colored fur, intelligent amber eyes, and a posture that blended alertness with youthful energy. Ranger had been with Jake since he was a puppy, trained partly with military-style obedience, but also shaped by Jake's patient, steady hand. The dog was loyal, intuitive, and unusually perceptive, qualities that made him Jake's closest companion in a life that had grown quieter after leaving the Marines. They often took this trail in the late afternoon, a ritual Jake found grounding. But today, Ranger's behavior shifted. His ears perked sharply, his tail stiffened, and he let out a focused, low bark, one Jake recognized not as excitement, but as the signal that something unfamiliar was nearby. "Easy, boy," Jake said, his deep voice steady yet attentive. But Ranger didn't relax. Instead, he bolted forward, sprinting down the path toward a narrow rock formation Jake rarely explored. Jake followed, boots crunching against dry pine needles. The wind picked up slightly, rustling branches overhead as he maneuvered past boulders and fallen branches. Ranger stopped near a shallow ravine carved out by years of rain and melting snow. He barked again, digging at the ground as if trying to unearth something. Jake crouched down beside him. "What do you got there?" The soil had been disturbed recently. Jake brushed away the loose dirt and exposed a corner of worn fabric, dark green, frayed at the edges, and half buried beneath a layer of pine needles and dust. He tugged gently until a partially buried backpack slid free, its surface weather-beaten and scratched, as if it had been here for weeks or months. It wasn't the kind of backpack hikers usually carried. This one was older, heavier, and military-styled, but not standard issue. Jake's instincts sharpened. Something about the way it was hidden, intentionally, not accidentally lost, sent a ripple of unease down his spine. Ranger sniffed the bag intensely, whining softly, as if sensing the distress of whoever left it behind. Jake unzipped the main compartment carefully. Inside, wrapped in a plastic sheet for protection, was a small leather journal and a photograph. The journal felt surprisingly intact. Its cover was scratched, but not ruined. Jake opened it to the first page and immediately recognized the tremble in the handwriting. Someone had written under fear. Flipping through a few entries, he noticed the name Emily Parker repeated multiple times. She described being followed, losing trust in people around her, hiding in the woods, and trying to protect herself and, from the way she phrased things, possibly someone she cared deeply about. One line stood out sharply. "If anyone finds this, please help. I don't know who I can trust anymore." Jake's brows tightened. He didn't know Emily, but he remembered hearing her name around town a month earlier when posters of a missing woman had briefly circulated. Emily Parker, a woman in her early 30s, slim, with shoulder-length chestnut hair and gentle brown eyes according to the poster, a single mother who worked part-time at the Pine Ridge Library, had vanished without explanation. People had whispered theories, but nothing had been confirmed. Jake looked at the photograph next. It showed a smiling woman who matched the missing person description, standing beside a young girl, maybe 8 or 9, with curly dark hair and bright hazel eyes. They looked happy, ordinary, peaceful, a sharp contrast to the fear in the journal entries. Ranger nudged Jake's arm, sensing the tension in his posture. "Yeah," Jake murmured, exhaling slowly. "This isn't just lost property." He studied the forest around him, suddenly aware of how isolated the ravine was. Whoever hid the backpack had chosen a place far from the usual trails, a place only someone desperate or frightened would choose. Jake slipped the journal and photograph back into the bag, zipping it closed. The wind whistled through the pines, colder than before, as if the forest itself sensed the shift in the air. Standing up, Jake felt the old instincts surface, the part of him trained to respond to danger, to protect, to investigate. Ranger stood beside him, steady and loyal. "Come on, boy," Jake said quietly. "Looks like we've got something to figure out." With the backpack slung over his shoulder, Jake began the walk back to the cabin, unaware that the simple afternoon hike had just pulled him into a mystery far deeper than he imagined. One that began with a frightened woman's journal and would soon reveal the darkness hiding beneath the calm surface of Pine Ridge. Jake returned to his cabin just as the pale afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the wooden porch and the old pine trees that stood like silent guards around the property. The cabin was modest but sturdy, built from weather-worn logs and smelling faintly of cedar and old books. Inside, the air held the warmth of the fireplace that Jake had lit earlier that morning, a contrast to the growing chill outside. Ranger padded in behind him, shaking bits of dirt from his thick fur before settling beside Jake's well-worn armchair. Jake placed the aged backpack on the dining table and sat down, flipping open the leather journal once more. The handwriting was uneven, showing fear and haste. He read the entries carefully now, absorbing every detail Emily Parker had recorded in her frantic scrawl. Emily, from what he recalled of the missing posters, was a woman in her early 30s with a quiet, bookish appearance, someone who seemed unlikely to be caught in anything dangerous. But the journal told a different story. A story of a woman pushed into fear by forces far greater than herself. Emily described being followed by two men on multiple occasions. She never mentioned their names, but she wrote of their appearance. One tall and wiry with a narrow face, sharp cheekbones, and restless gray eyes that darted around as if searching for threats. The other broader, with a shaved head, heavy brow, and a scar that cut diagonally from his left ear to his jaw. She wrote that they confronted her more than once, warning her not to speak about what she knew. Jake frowned at the entries. These were not ordinary townsfolk. These were men accustomed to intimidation. Ranger lifted his head and let out a low huff, as if sensing Jake's growing unease. Jake closed the journal gently and exhaled. The next logical step would be to report the discovery to the Pine Ridge Sheriff's Office, even if something in his gut already told him the reaction wouldn't be pleasant. The sheriff's station sat near the center of town, a squat tan brick building beside the local post office. When Jake walked in, he was greeted by a receptionist named Linda Brewer, a middle-aged woman with short sandy hair, soft blue eyes, and a cautious but polite demeanor. Linda had always been kind in the few interactions Jake had with her, but today she seemed unusually stiff, her smile forced as if something weighed on her mind. "Hey, Jake," she said, folding her hands neatly on the desk. "What brings you in?" "I found something in the woods," Jake replied, keeping his tone steady. "A backpack. Belongs to Emily Parker." Linda's expression faltered just slightly, barely noticeable, but Jake caught it. "Emily, that case is still open," she murmured. "Let me get the sheriff." Sheriff Dale Harrison emerged from his office a moment later. He was a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s, with thinning brown hair and a mustache that he trimmed meticulously. His features were round and heavy, and his voice carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. At first glance, he seemed friendly enough, but Jake had always sensed a hardness behind the sheriff's eyes, a man who valued control above all else. "Jake," Sheriff Harrison greeted him, forcing a genial tone. "Linda says you found something?" Jake set the backpack on the counter. "Found this buried out near the ridge. Emily Parker's journal was inside." The sheriff's face stiffened, but he masked it behind a curt nod. "We'll take it from here." Jake waited for him to ask questions, where he found it, whether he saw footprints, anything. But Harrison reached for the backpack with an eagerness that felt wrong, as if he already knew what was inside. "You didn't read it, did you?" the sheriff asked, his tone suddenly sharp. Jake held his gaze. "I skimmed it, enough to know she was scared." "Jake," Harrison said with a forced sigh. "Cases like these are delicate. Best not to get involved." Ranger growled softly at the sheriff's tone, causing Harrison to glance at the dog with a hint of irritation. Jake sensed something was off. The journal entries about being followed, the sheriff's reactions, Linda's nervousness. They formed a pattern he couldn't ignore. Someone didn't want Emily's information getting out. When he stepped outside, the sky had darkened further, heavy clouds rumbling in the distance. Ranger stood close to Jake, as if urging him not to stop now. "Come on, boy," Jake muttered. "Let's check the woods again." Back at the forest's edge near his property, Ranger caught a scent and darted ahead, nose low, tail straight. Jake followed as the dog led him off the usual path and deeper into a small clearing where the remains of an old campsite sat abandoned. The soil was disturbed, the ashes of a fire pit still visible though long cold. A torn piece of fabric, likely from a jacket, hung from a branch nearby. Jake crouched, running his fingers over the soil, Footprints, faint but present. The size and shape suggested they belonged to a woman. Emily had definitely been here. Ranger circled the clearing, sniffing intensely, his amber eyes alert. Jake pressed his lips together. Emily hadn't just hidden in fear. She had been preparing to stay alive. And if the sheriff didn't want to hear the truth, then someone in the town might be involved. This was no misunderstanding. Someone in Pine Ridge didn't want Emily found. Jake returned to Pine Ridge the next morning with a clear plan forming in his mind. The sheriff's strange reaction still clung to him like a cold mist, and he knew he needed information from someone who wasn't tied to the authorities. That led him to Dawson's Diner, a small chrome-sided building sitting at the edge of Main Street, its neon sign flickering in the gray morning light. The parking lot was nearly empty except for 2 dusty pickup trucks, and as Jake pushed open the door, the familiar smell of bacon and old coffee greeted him. Behind the counter stood Mark Dawson, the diner's owner and longtime local. Mark was a man in his mid-40s, tall with a slightly stooped posture that suggested years of bending over grills and counters. His dark hair was beginning to gray at the temples, and a thick but neatly trimmed beard framed his broad, tired face. Mark had deep-set brown eyes, kind, but shadowed by the weight of someone who had seen too much of people's secrets. He was known around town as the kind of man who kept quiet, but observed everything. Rumor had it he had once lived in a bigger city and left after a personal tragedy, though he rarely spoke about it. Jake sat at the counter, and Mark raised an eyebrow in greeting. "Morning, Jake," he said in a voice that carried a rough warmth. "Coffee?" "Yeah, thanks," Jake replied. Mark poured the coffee silently, but kept glancing at Jake with a perceptive curiosity. "You look like a man with questions," he finally said. Jake didn't waste time. "Emily Parker, you remember her?" Mark froze for half a heartbeat, then leaned closer. "Keep your voice down," he murmured. "Why are you asking?" Jake lowered his tone. "Found something of hers, out in the woods. Looks like she was running from someone." Mark exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. "She came in here a month ago. Looked scared out of her mind. Pale, shaking, eyes darting like she expected someone to burst through the door. I tried asking if she needed help, but she just kept saying someone in town was after her, someone dangerous." "Did she say who?" Jake asked. Mark shook his head, rubbing his forehead. "She wouldn't, but she mentioned people who should be protecting her." He gave Jake a pointed look, the implication clear. Someone in law enforcement. Jake felt the tension coil in his chest. After what he saw at the sheriff's office, it didn't surprise him. "There's more," Mark continued. "When she left, 2 men came in the next morning asking questions about her. Tall, wiry guy with shifting eyes, and another with a scar on his jaw. They made everyone in the diner uncomfortable. Sheriff Harrison talked to them out back. They left after that." Jake's expression hardened. Those were the same men Emily described in her journal. A low vibration buzzed through the diner floor. Ranger, lying under Jake's stool, lifted his head, ears perked. The dog never reacted without reason. Jake glanced out the window, but the street outside looked normal. Still, the tension rode on his shoulders. "I need to know if Emily said anything else," Jake pressed. Mark hesitated, then reached beneath the counter. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges. "She left this behind. I kept it in case someone ever came asking." Jake unfolded it. The writing was rushed. "If they find me, everything ends. Don't trust them." No signature, but the handwriting matched the journal. Jake nodded, sliding the note into his pocket. "Thanks, Mark." Be careful, Jake, Mark warned, eyes serious. This town, it's not as quiet as it looks. Jake left the diner with a heavier mind. Ranger trotted beside him, head low, sensing the unease radiating from his owner. As the day faded into night, Jake returned to his cabin, the forest around him growing darker, wind whispering through the pines like a warning. He unlocked the door, Ranger slipping in first as usual. Jake scanned the shadows automatically, a marine instinct he never lost. Ranger suddenly stiffened, hackles rising. A deep growl rumbled from his chest. "What is it, boy?" Jake whispered. Ranger padded toward the window facing the driveway. Jake followed, peering out through the narrow gap in the curtains. A car he didn't recognize sat at the edge of the property. Dark, dusty, engine off, no lights. A silhouette remained inside, unmoving. Jake's pulse quickened. Whoever it was had been waiting. Jake knelt beside Ranger, resting a steadying hand on the dog's strong shoulders. "Someone knows we found the journal," he murmured, "and they're watching us." Ranger growled again, deeper this time, not out of fear but readiness. Jake tightened his jaw. "We're not backing down." The pines outside swayed with the rising wind, and the night pressed in close, as if the entire forest sensed the danger arriving at Jake's doorstep. The moment Jake spotted the unfamiliar car parked at the edge of his property, he felt the old instinctive tension coil through his muscles. Ranger remained pressed to the window, ears high, body stiff, his amber eyes focused on the shadow inside the vehicle. Whoever it was had been watching them long enough for the engine to cool, meaning this wasn't a random passerby. It was someone waiting. Jake quietly backed away from the window, grabbed the backpack containing Emily's journal, and slung it over his shoulder. "We're leaving," he whispered. Ranger responded instantly, nudging Jake's leg as if urging him to move faster. He slipped out the back door and into the tree line behind the cabin. The night air was sharp and cold, filled with the scent of pine resin and damp soil. Overhead, clouds drifted across the moon, creating long, shifting shadows that made the forest look alive. Behind them, a car door slammed. Someone cursed under their breath. A rough male voice, unfamiliar but dangerous. Jake pushed deeper into the woods. Ranger ran ahead, pausing occasionally to look back and ensure Jake kept pace. Behind them, flashlights cut through the darkness, beams darting between trunks and branches. There were at least 2 lights, maybe 3, too many for Jake to confront alone. Branches snapped under hurried footsteps. The pursuers were moving fast. Jake ducked behind a fallen log, catching his breath. Ranger crouched beside him, his body low, muscles coiled, eyes bright with focus. Jake listened. One of the men had a heavy stride, boots thudding with weight and impatience. Another had quicker steps, lighter but frantic, like someone eager to impress or desperate to finish a job. Jake couldn't see their faces, but from their movements he sensed aggression, not fear. The beams of the flashlights swept dangerously close. Jake needed cover. Ranger gave a quiet whine, shifting eastward, signaling something. Jake trusted the dog's instincts more than his own in the darkness. "Lead the way," he murmured. They slipped through a patch of dense underbrush, branches scratching against Jake's jacket. The forest grew steeper, the terrain uneven. Jake recognized this area. It led toward an old trail that was rarely used anymore. Then he saw it through the trees, a small abandoned hunting cabin, half collapsed, leaning into the hillside as though holding on for dear life. The weather-beaten structure had once belonged to a retired trapper decades ago. Jake had passed it a few times, but never explored it. Ranger trotted ahead and pushed the broken door open with his nose. Inside, the air was stale and cold. Moonlight slipped through gaps in the roof, illuminating the dust in the air. Old crates and rusted tools lay scattered around, long forgotten. But something else caught Jake's attention immediately. A tattered blue jacket hanging from a bent nail on the wall. It didn't belong here. Jake approached it and ran his fingers over the fabric. It was small, feminine, and worn. A faint scent of pine and sweat clung to it, too fresh to be decades old. Emily had been here. Ranger sniffed around, pulled toward a corner where an empty water bottle lay half buried in dust. Beside it, on the ground, was a scrap of paper. Jake picked it up carefully. The handwriting was hurried, jagged, almost identical to the fear-soaked lines in the journal. "Don't trust the police." Jake felt a jolt in his chest. This wasn't paranoia. Emily had been terrified enough to hide here, writing warnings in the dark. And considering what he'd seen from Sheriff Harrison and the two men following her, she had every reason. A sound outside snapped him back to the present, gravel shifting beneath footsteps. The pursuers had reached the cabin's vicinity. Jake blew out a slow breath. "They're close," he whispered. Ranger growled softly, the hairs along his spine lifting. Jake crouched behind an overturned table, pulling Ranger beside him. Through a crack in the splintered wall, he saw two figures moving outside. One man was tall and wiry with a jittery posture, his narrow face illuminated briefly by the beam of his flashlight. The other was bulkier with a shaved head and thick neck, his movements confident, almost arrogant. They matched Emily's descriptions perfectly. "They must be nearby," the wiry man hissed, voice sharp like broken glass. "Then find them," the larger man growled, impatience dripping from his tone. Jake held Ranger close, steadying the dog's breathing with a firm hand. This wasn't the time to fight. It was a time to survive. The men circled the cabin, but after minutes of searching, they moved on, disappearing back into the trees. Their flashlights faded into the darkness. Jake waited several minutes before standing. Ranger exhaled sharply, shaking tension from his body. Jake looked at the jacket, the bottle, the note. Emily was alive, at least when she'd been here, and if the sheriff and these men were involved, he couldn't trust anyone but himself. He tightened the backpack straps. "If she's out there, we're going to find her," he whispered. Ranger barked softly, as if agreeing. The night was far from over, but Jake felt a new clarity forming. He wasn't just following clues anymore. He was stepping into a battle against the darkness hidden inside Pine Ridge. Jake left the abandoned cabin before dawn, moving through the trees with a determined pace as the first faint light spread across the forest. Ranger trotted beside him, the dog's breath forming small clouds in the cold morning air. Jake had spent most of the night studying the map he had found tucked inside the backpack, an old trail layout with a circled location on the eastern ridge. It was rough, hand-drawn, but its markings matched the direction Emily's movements seemed to follow. If she had hidden in the woods, escaped pursuers, and left notes behind, this marked spot might be her last refuge, or her prison. By midday, Jake and Ranger reached the edge of the ridge. The terrain shifted from dense forest to a rocky incline dotted with sagebrush and twisted pines clinging to the slope. Ranger suddenly stiffened, lowering his head and sniffing the wind. Jake followed his gaze. Half buried under a veil of wild shrubs was an entrance, metal doors sunken into the earth. A forgotten storm shelter or an old storage bunker, perhaps. But the padlock hanging from the latch was new, shiny, and out of place, as if someone had sealed it recently. Jake approached slowly. Ranger gave a soft, tense whine. Voices drifted from below, muffled, low, but unmistakably human. Jake crouched behind a boulder, evaluating the situation. The voice belonged to a man, deep and irritated, and then another quieter one responded. The second voice was shaky, frightened. Emily. He felt his muscles tighten with urgency. A shadow moved near the bunker entrance. A guard stood watch. A man in his late 40s, tall and broad-shouldered with a thick beard peppered by gray. His hair was cut short, military style, though unevenly maintained. His square jaw and weathered skin marked him as someone who had spent years outdoors or in hard labor. His expression was stern, the kind of cold detachment belonging to men who followed orders without question. A faded scar ran across his eyebrow, hinting at a violent past. This was not a local townsman. His posture, alert and disciplined, suggested former security or paramilitary work. Jake studied his movements. The guard checked his phone, frowned, and began pacing, impatient but focused. Ranger glanced up, awaiting Jake's command. Jake whispered, "Circle around, distract him, no close contact." Ranger nudged Jake's hand in acknowledgement, then crept silently toward the opposite side of the clearing, disappearing into the brush. Moments later, a growl echoed from the trees. The guard turned sharply, flashlight raised, scanning the shadows. Ranger moved again, creating noise farther away. "What the hell?" the guard muttered, stepping toward the sound. Jake seized the opening. He dashed to the bunker doors, cutting the padlock with the bolt cutters he carried in his pack, an old habit from his Marine days. The lock snapped with a muted crack. Jake lifted the doors just enough to slip inside. The bunker smelled of cold metal and stale air. A single bulb cast a dim glow down the narrow corridor. At the end of it, seated on the floor with her hands loosely tied, was Emily Parker. She looked thinner than her photo, pale skin, hollow cheeks, and dark circles under her chestnut brown eyes. Her hair, once tidy and neatly cut to her shoulders, was tangled and matted. Despite her exhaustion, when she saw Jake, relief bloomed across her face. "Jake Miller," she whispered, voice trembling with disbelief. "I'm here to get you out," Jake said, helping her stand. Emily steadied herself. "They're working with someone important, someone powerful. It's not just two men." Jake nodded. "I know. But you're safe now." A shout came from above. The guard had discovered the ruse. "Move!" Jake urged. They climbed the steps just as the guard reached the entrance. Ranger lunged from the side, barking fiercely, forcing the man to stumble backward. Jake pulled Emily behind him, shielding her as he and Ranger retreated into the forest. They ran through the trees, the guard shouting after them, but the terrain was on Jake's side. Within minutes, they lost their pursuer in the thick undergrowth. Later that afternoon, Jake brought Emily to Mark Dawson's diner. Its closed sign flipped and curtains drawn for privacy. Mark looked shocked at Emily's condition, but he immediately locked the doors and brewed hot tea. Emily, sitting at the counter, finally revealed the truth. "A businessman named Robert Claiborne," she said, voice shaky. "He owns half the land around this town. He's been laundering money for years. Sheriff Harrison and a few others are helping cover it up. I found documents at the library and confronted the wrong person. They've been hunting me ever since." Claiborne, a wealthy figure known in Pine Ridge for sponsoring town events, was someone people respected. But Jake had always sensed something too polished about him. A man in his early 60s, tall, immaculate suits, silver hair combed back, and a smile that never reached his cold blue eyes. His reputation for generosity hid a controlling, calculated personality. "We need someone outside this town," Jake said. "Someone they can't influence." "FBI," Emily whispered. Jake nodded. That evening, Jake contacted federal agents through a regional field office, presenting Emily's testimony and the journal. The evidence was overwhelming. Within 2 days, Claiborne, Sheriff Harrison, and several accomplices were arrested. The truth hit Pine Ridge like a storm. Emily was reunited with her daughter, who had been living with a neighbor since her disappearance. Tears flowed freely, the child clinging to her mother with a joy only the rescued can feel. Jake and Ranger stood at the edge of the forest days later, watching the autumn sun glow between the pines. Emily approached, smiling softly. "Thank you," she whispered. Jake simply nodded, placing a hand on Ranger's back. The dog wagged his tail, sensing the peace restored. Together, they walked into the woods, the place where the mystery began, now quiet at last. Sometimes, the darkest nights lead us to the brightest places. Jake and Ranger didn't just save Emily. They reminded us that even in a world full of fear, corruption, and uncertainty, there are still people willing to stand up, protect the vulnerable, and fight for what is right. And maybe that courage, that unexpected help arriving at the very moment someone needs it most, is a reminder that God still sends us small miracles through ordinary people. In our everyday lives, we may not face the dangers that Emily did, but we all carry hidden battles: loneliness, worry, heartbreak, or the feeling that no one is listening. Yet stories like this remind us that God works quietly, often through kindness, bravery, and the compassion of strangers. Sometimes the miracle is not thunder in the sky. It's a gentle nudge in the heart telling us to help someone, reach out, forgive, or believe again. So as you finish this story, may you be reminded that you are never walking alone. May God bless you, protect your family, and guide your steps with His light, just as He guided Jake and Ranger through the darkness. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment to let us know your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more true-to-life stories of faith, kindness, and second chances. May the Lord watch over you and every person who is listening right now. Amen.